tonight I'm here as the clerk historian for Brandon Patty, who is the clerk of the Circuit Court. And I'm going to talk about some of the documents that they have here. Probably most of you, if you've interacted with the clerk of the court and all the documents, it's you probably to record the deed to your house, maybe to get a marriage certificate, maybe a mortgage, maybe a divorce. So they do all these things. He deals with papers that are important to people's lives. And I think that's one, and so all the papers there have a story behind them. So not only am I interested in the papers themselves, but I'm always interested in the people that are behind these very flat-looking, almost boring papers. And the clerk of the court is a many-faceted position, and my responsibility is to help him with the old documents. And as I said, part of it includes recording legal documents, especially land records, estate papers, another time you might interact with the clerk's office if someone in your family has died, and others that are types that are too many to mention. The clerk's office has been doing this since September of 1821, right after Florida became part of the U.S., 2 months after Florida became a U.S. territory. And there are documents there that were important to private individuals, and as I said, there are good stories behind them. And so I want to talk about the treasures in the clerk's office.
Yes.
The treasures in the clerk's office. Now, if I said I'm going to talk about treasures, is this not the image that would come to mind? Mm-hmm. Well, the clerk conserves a book of records actually left from the Spanish colonial period before the clerk's office was created. It's an interesting story as to why it is there, and that's the first one I'm going to tell. But I will show you what the treasure box of the Spanish papers looks like at the Clerk of Court of St. Johns County. And there you go. Wow. It is, and never end, I will go into the background, but this collection is known as the bread box papers. Not surprisingly, it's rather battery. And you can see it's been named for the container that they've been conserved in for many years, but not originally. We're not sure we quite know when they were put in the bread box. The bread box was delivered, or the bread box papers, were delivered to the clerk in 1870, so almost 150 years ago. And they are the original notarized records written in Governor's House right across the street, or sometimes in the homes of the notaries public especially, or they might go to someone's house if it was a deathbed will, because people in those days didn't usually make wills in advance, they made them at the last minute. And then they bring all those papers together and combine them into a book, unlike the books today, which the clerks have, which is books of copies. These are the original documents signed by the people. They might have their own version as well. There's the top of the treasure box. And somebody stenciled this probably in the 1950s telling us, do not handle.
The red box papers.
The red box papers, yes. That is the top of the book. It is from 1803, 1804, late Spanish period. And that is what we might call the spine of the book. Now the book, remember, this book was created, or these papers were created 220 plus years ago. They're in very good shape if you actually think about it. I'll show you some more in a minute, because they're made of very good paper. Of course, because they were intended to last a long time. And so you can see how they would get a group of them and sew them together, and then this book covers 2 years, so they would take that whole 2 years worth of papers and put them all together in one book. There you can see some of the string that's coming loose. These are photos that I took about a year and a half ago. And I'm sorry, this is how it came out of my phone, but you can see the writing. You can see that there's some holes in the paper because they've been around a long time, and bugs do like paper. And this is Florida, and we have lots of bugs. This book is from 1803, 1804, and so because of the time period, many of the records in this book deal with slaves, because those were very, very important to people's lives in Florida in 1803 and 1804. So let me show you a few of the records that are in here, and maybe a little bit of the backstory that I've tried to follow. This is, as I said, the signature of a purchase and sale of a slave, and these, unlike we do today, the person on the left, you can see down at the bottom, Cristobal Parsi is the seller, and Bartolome is the purchaser. Well, this whole transaction started in the Yucatan, when an individual captured a boat full of slaves. He was a privateer. He had to take whatever he captured into what was called a privateer's court at that time and prove that he had legally captured it, which is what, privateers are kind of like legal pirates, which I always think is an oxymoron. But that's how it works. And so he went to Merida, which is close to Cancun, and what he captured was considered legal at that time. And so he has to bring the paperwork with him wherever he goes to prove that he legally owns the people. We're not going to debate those issues, but this is the way it was at the time. He legally owns the people and anything else that he may be selling. And so this is the document written in Mexico. There's a seal at the top, just like you might have now from somebody sending something. Of course, anytime you get a seal on something, it costs you money, and usually there's a little comment about how much you have to have. And so the man who captured the boat brings this paper with him to St. Augustine and attaches it to the paper that he's going to sell. He's going to sell a slave in St. Augustine. Mark Miner at the clerk's office noticed when we were looking at it, he said, "Oh look," he said, "you can see where he folded it up and put it in his pocket." And then of course now it's open. So we have this paper that came from Mexico in the bread box papers because it's part of this whole transaction. There are other documents in there as well. We have the will of Lieutenant Jose Fernandez, who was too weak to sign. It actually says that because he had to sign with an X mark. And even today, when you sign with an X mark, it takes extra certification that the person was unable to sign for some reason. Perhaps it's because they don't know how to write, or perhaps it's because they've had a stroke and they can't write. But it takes extra certification to identify that someone has signed with an X mark. And so he was too weak. There is a marriage agreement where one of the gifts to the bride and groom was a slave owned by the father. As I said, these books are almost everything in this book, or at least I would say probably 60% of it has something to do with a transaction involving slaves. And then one of the really interesting ones, which is not involved with a slave, is a protesta. It's a complaint affidavit where a man is caught off the St. Augustine Inlet. He can't get in because the weather's too bad. The harbor pilot refuses to come out and get him in, help him in, and so his boat falls apart and sinks. And he makes an affidavit, a lengthy, about 9-page affidavit, because he intends to sue the harbor pilot. And so he wants to get this in the record, just like when you're interviewed today, or people are interviewed today about crimes or other events. You want to get somebody's memory while it's fresh. And so he makes an affidavit to make sure, and he does it in front of the Spanish notary, make sure it doesn't get lost. He puts it in with all these other land records. And he later does sue the harbor pilot. Now, I've only translated a little bit of his protesta, and I haven't gotten into the 145-page case against the harbor pilot, because it wasn't a project I was doing, and I decided that just wasn't where I was going at that time. So these are the sorts of things that are in there, but still, but we must wonder, not only did the man lose his boat, but what was on the cargo? How many people's events, how many people's letters to lost ones? Where at this time, if you're going to communicate with someone at a distance, and from Florida, you probably sent a lot of letters to Mexico. If you're sending them to Mexico, to Spanish Florida, or other parts, it would have gone on a boat. And so it's not just his boat that's lost, but his cargo is lost. And cargo that may have little or no value, as for compensation, but very important to the people that expected to receive it. Okay. In 1821, Florida becomes part of the United States, becomes a territory, and the clerk of the court's office is created. As I mentioned to you, this book that I just talked about, the bread box papers, it's not an anomaly. We know exactly where it belongs. It belongs with all the other Spanish documents that were taken to the Library of Congress in 1905. But we don't know why it was pulled out. Did somebody do it on purpose because of something that was in there? Or was it just a simple oversight? I don't know that we'll ever know. So the records, I'm going back a little here, but the bread box paper records should have gone to Havana, with the Spanish governor when he left. There was a debate between the incoming American government, the outgoing Spanish government, as to who would have the papers, and the American officials seized them out of the Spanish governor's office. They never got to Havana. They stayed in St. Augustine for a while and ultimately were sent to the Library of Congress in 1905. Library of Congress recently digitized them. You can find them online. Like most government documents, they're very difficult to find just because of how they're organized. Why this was left, I don't know. But, and of course, from my perspective as a historian, I'm delighted that they're in Washington and on microfilm and now digitized, because if they were in Havana, it would be much harder for me to get to them. And they might not be conserved in quite as good a condition as they are at the Library of Congress. But anyway, in 1821, Florida becomes part of the United States, and the clerk of St. John's County is created, and of course, the clerk of St. John's County. Now, I'm going to go back to the, Now, St. John's County in 1821 goes from the Swanee River to Key West. So anything, now of course most of this is not populated by people that make documents at that time, but there are records of transactions in the Keys and around the Indian River in the St. John's County clerk's office when those places were part of St. John's County before all those counties were spun off. It won't be long because the next year Duval County's recorded. St. John's County, as someone told me one time, it was a big conspiracy to make the county smaller. Well, I don't know if that's true. I think it was just, pretty much unmanageable. Imagine having to do your legal work from Key West and having to bring it to St. John's County. But that's how much it covered at the time. Wanted to show you a few documents from this really early time period, and this is one that I think we hear about from time to time, but this one is in the clerk's office. This is a manumission document. In other words, this individual is freeing an enslaved female woman. I'm sorry, that was, anyway, he's freeing an enslaved female. And so it says, you can probably read that back there, but just so you can look at the document and I can tell you what it says. That Francis Gay liberated Jenny, his slave, on October 18, 1830. After he was paid $350 for her freedom. It doesn't say who paid it, or she may have earned the money and purchased herself in that sense. Jenny was about 35 years old, and her manumission document is recorded in Deed Book IJ-14. And so that most manumission documents apparently were not recorded. We do not have a lot of these in the records, although people were freed over time. Next one. There were other activities by blacks in St. Augustine. I'm pointing that because they're more unusual than some of the others that are there. This is a deed of property by Francis Philip Edinburgh was his name. He was a free black man. He was free when Florida became part of the U.S. He had been free during the Spanish period. And he owned land out along what is today Holmes Boulevard, out where the city well lakes are, And so he'd acquired the land during the Spanish period, and he sells this to John Hanson. John Hanson will create a sugar plantation out there, and look at the incident of a free black man selling this land to someone who's going to create a sugar plantation, which of course will put lots of enslaved blacks to work. It's an interesting juxtaposition of the time, about the times. There's also some really interesting, in the really early book, documents by the Seminoles, which is pretty unusual, involving the Seminoles, because pretty soon after Florida became part of the U.S., the Seminoles didn't do their own documentation anymore. The Indian agent had to do it for them. So we have a few of these that are actually involving the Seminoles, you might say, face to face. In Deed Book A, which as you might imagine is the first deed book, because it's Deed Book A before they started numbering them, Mackenzie, with a good Scottish name, but he's a Seminole Indian, transferred the ownership of Beck, an enslaved woman, to Mr. Dexter and Mr. Sanchez, and they ran an Indian trading store at Volusia, which is about where Astor is today, below Lake George, on the St. Johns River. So they record that's a later map there. You can see where Volusia is, just south of Lake George. The second page of this document is the list of what they purchased at the store in exchange for what they were paid for the slave woman. So, and they had a little cash left over. And so I don't know if you can see it at the back. I'm not going to read you the whole list. This is in English, so I just had to transcribe it so it was legible. 76.5 yards of blue broadcloth, and the price for each is listed. There's some tinware, tobacco, handkerchief, flints, an American first quality rifle, which went for $160 at that time apparently. Some thread, scissors, a file, a kettle, and a looking glass. And then there's some money still due to Mackenzie because he didn't quite take everything out in trade, you might say. There are some other, there's some other interesting ones too. I didn't put all of them in here. That went on for years in the Spanish period, that finally got recorded during the American period of, it's so intricate, of Polly, who is a woman that is sold to Pompey. Pompey is a slave of the Indian chief Payne's Prairie. And then she is sold to someone else. She eventually buys her freedom. She has a little note about it, and she goes to work at some point, probably as sort of a housekeeper or something, for a man who's here briefly in town as an American official, Alexander Hamilton Jr., the son of Alexander Hamilton. And Alexander Hamilton Jr. insists that she record all the list of transactions that took place that led to her being free. So she has a manumission document too that's hidden all these things that go from 1811 until she's finally freed. And finally, 25 years later, she records this document that she's freed at the urging of Alexander Hamilton Jr., who was here for a short period of time as district attorney for East Florida, and then he went on back to either New Jersey or New York. This was not one of his most successful postings, but that's a different story. I want to go to another group of documents, and I'm glad you mentioned this, Donna. The clerk has discharge documents from many years ago. Probably most of you are familiar with, if you're familiar with military discharge documents today, you know the term DD 214, which was established in 1950, because DD stands for the Department of Defense, but the Department of Defense didn't exist until about 1950. Before then, there was the Department of War, Department of the Navy, and all of the branches. And so in the fall of 1919, shortly after World War I, the clerk of St. Johns County Courts begins recording discharge certificates because they're important for perhaps benefits to prove that you ever served, and who knows what they might be important for. These people have documents, and now they have some place to protect them should they, get water soaked, they lose them, they burn, or something like that. And so they bring them to the clerk's office, they make a copy of them. They may make a copy by hand as to what it says, and pretty soon they start making what we would call photocopies, although they're actually true photocopies, they're camera copies. And many of them, which I do show here in positive, but when you look in the books of documents, they're actually negatives. They're white writing on black because they didn't print them as positives. They just printed them as the negatives. And so I'm going to show you a few of those, and we'll see how they change over time as to what is important, because you can read about, of course, where the person served, their dates, their health and character, which is always kind of interesting, their occupation before they enlisted sometimes, identifying marks, because you want to make sure you have the right person. I remember one man who must have had a tattoo for every place he'd ever been assigned to. And they describe all the tattoos, besides mother and the dog's name, there's like Singapore and all these other things. So he's got this whole list of, it says identifying marks. Well, it's like an atlas of the world as to where he had been. And for a while, whether or not you could ride a horse. Because of course during World War II, that was important because you still had mounted troops at that time. And there's also transportation on the final pay and transportation home. So what I did was I took a few of these documents, more than I'm showing you here, and used some other local information, city directories and a few other things, to try to build a little bit of the story of the person who was discharged and what we know about them. This is one of the early books. You can see it says Soldiers and Sailors Discharge Records. They continue to copy DD-214s. Now there is no charge for that. And I do not have any of those here because most of them still are, because of their age, are under privacy restrictions. Not all of them, but I just stopped before I got to any of those. And because these are a little more colorful or more elaborate. Well, look at this one. Isn't that one elaborate? Frank M. Howe this is the discharge document of Frank M. Howe, as you can see, a chief musician in the Philippine Islands from 1899 till 1901 during the Spanish-American War. This was his discharge. He moved to Crescent Beach in 1908. I found a newspaper article about him. And he is buried in the St. Augustine National Cemetery. But look at the blanks being filled in with that almost Old English style writing. And of course I included a photo from Harper's Weekly about the men leaving San Francisco Harbor to go to the Philippines. There's his military record. He was chief musician. His distinguished service was none. So I don't know what they, at that time, I don't know what they, they probably have a qualifier as to what distinguished service is. And his expeditions, look how elaborate that is. And it took me quite a while to figure out where some of those places were in an atlas of the Philippines, and I'm still not sure that I got them. But he received no wounds, but the remarks, he was honest, a faithful character, and excellent. And so that is his record, which he records many years after he gets it, because it wasn't available to be recorded when he was discharged. We move on to World War I. Lieutenant Colonel Griffin and Private Henry Isaac took part in what is probably one of the most famous offenses during World War I, the Loos Argonne offensive. That's where the huge cemetery is in France. It was the largest United States, it was one of the largest offensives ever in the United States military, involving 1.2 American soldiers. And it lasted from the end of September, until the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. In other words, it lasted 6 weeks. And you can pretty well tell that by the terrain that's shown in that photo. The reverse side of the discharges, which you'll see in a minute, show that they participated in this very important offensive. After the war, Lieutenant Colonel Griffin comes to St. Augustine, where he was a surgeon and had his office on Cathedral Place. And the 1937 directory for St. Augustine tells us that Private Isaac was a laborer who at that time resided in Lincolnville, 20 years after he had been in France. This is the discharge for Lieutenant Colonel Griffin. I don't know what had happened to his. Perhaps it was in such bad shape they couldn't photograph it or something, because it's been completely retyped, and all the signatures actually are exactly the same of the clerk that did the copying. So here he had to make a document, fill-in document. This is the discharge certificate of Henry Isaac. Tells where he was discharged and things like that. But as I go through, I want you to look at the top of the discharge certificates, and you'll see how they look different. Each branch of the service had their own, and sometimes they almost had to make up that didn't have supply of them, so they made them up where they were discharging. This all precedes the consolidation of the armed forces under the Department of Defense. So it was very, and Don, I see you shaking your head, it was very much more individual among the services. We have Ella Virginia Oliver, who is a nurse in World War I. She was part of the Army Nurse Corps. They don't even have any sort of insignia. They just have Army Nurse Corps, and that's it. She was diagnosed with the Spanish flu, something that we've all become familiar with in the past 2 years, and was hospitalized for 10 days. I will say that on the back of her record, I am saying it was the Spanish flu because of when she had it, and the Spanish flu was everywhere, and she was in the hospital for 2 weeks, so it just really fits the pattern, but it never says on the document that it's the Spanish flu. Because the Spanish flu killed more than 20 million people worldwide. After she was discharged from the Army, she worked at Flagler Hospital when it was on Marine Street, as you mentioned earlier, Bill.
That's where she is now. Still.
And she lived on Marine Street as well, so she could definitely walk to work. And so these are all the little, when she came in, duty for the hospital, she came into New York City. When she was put in the hospital, her duty was suspended because she was ill and she was discharged. And so you can see that looks different from some of the others that we can see. And this is the last one that I have here. This is the one looking different still again, the Army of the United States, but he's in the Army Air Corps before the Army Air Corps has been separated out into the Air Force during James B. Badger became a fighter pilot at age 20. You know, it was the war. People were really being fast-tracked. He was from Hastings, flew a number of missions over France, and he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and was discharged at Camp Landing as a first lieutenant in September of 1945. And of course, he brings his certificate back to be recorded at the clerk's office. And it gives all the things what he did, and all the things, authorized flying cross, the cluster, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. His thumbprint over to the side. At some point, the fingerprints have been introduced to these documents. The earlier documents didn't have fingerprints. So they're, and I'm not familiar with DD-214s. I don't know how much they continue to change the form. They continue to change the form. Pardon?
That looks similar to an ED-214.
So they continue to change the forms as they need to know different information. So those are the things that I have for you